What is it that we most want in this life? Our wants often seem conditioned by the culture in which we live in, the people which we surround ourselves with, the media which we consume, and the advertisements that we watch. It does seem as though there is much in this world which is vying for our attention, attempting to convince us that we need certain things. And this wanting, this desire to have that which we do not already possess, is a paradigmatic aspect of the ego, of the egoic self. And the egoic self is a aspect of self which sees itself as separate from the world. And it often comes with a sense of a relentless striving, a kind of cycle of wanting which carries no clear resolution. It's a kind of just pattern that it sort of engulfs us in. And many of our actions and our decisions, when we are sort of identified with this egoic self, they become motivated and driven by this sort of relentless striving. They're not motivated by fulfillment, but rather discontentment. We believe that we must achieve or possess certain things before we can feel complete and content. And a question I want to pose to you is this notion that there could be a different way to exist, a different way to act and be in the world, which is not driven by discontentment, which is not driven by not enoughness, but rather is driven by a deep and known sense of completion, a kind of state where we recognize that we do not need external things to feel whole, because wholeness is already our baseline state. We are already whole. And now this state may seem difficult to conceive of, to conceptualize of, yet I would argue that it is profoundly simple, perhaps the simplest thing there ever is. Many sages and spiritual teachers, they affirm to us that our baseline state of being is whole. And now this, to many people's egos, this seems confusing. And this confusion comes because of attachment to our egos, because of our identification with a false and separate self. And when this identification, in essence, it leads us to operate in the world, operate with a mode of being which is predicated on illusion and on the belief, the mistaken beliefs that we must strive and achieve in order to feel complete, in order to feel worthy, in order to feel love. And now, having said this doesn't mean that we should abandon the pursuit of healing, of peace, of the pursuit of greater well-being. But I'm trying to give you pointers so that you will shift your orientation when you do these pursuits. You sort of shift the way your attention and your mind is operating and how it conceives of this thing. And I really want to hammer down the point that completion and peace can never be found outside of yourself or in any external achievement. We will never feel complete through having a particular job, particular house, particular family or possession. These objects, they may temporarily satisfy you, but they do not quell this insatiable drive of the ego. The cycle of desire will continue, and it will always fuel this unrelenting sense of insufficiency. And if the core of our being is rooted in an unrelenting sense of insufficiency, then we are still attached to our egos. Now, this is not to vilify the ego, but I want to highlight its patterns and how it influences our feelings and our motivations. the nature of ego is to create a sense of separation, a kind of survival mechanism which helps us to navigate the world by distinguishing between ourselves and others. We recognize our bodies as separate. We know to bring food to our mouths and not other people. We know to differentiate our speech from other speech. The ego, it has a practical utility in this sort of dimension of separation in order to coordinate social interactions. But I think it can be challenging for the ego to accept often that its sense of separation is not true. It's not reflective of our true highest identity. And often to a sort of more materialistic, secular and materialistically inclined audience, these terms of interconnectedness, that the ego is not our true identity, it can seem as though it's woo woo. But even if we stay within this sort of materialist frame of the universe and materialistic interactions, if we reflect upon the universe and its origin and the mythology of the Big Bang, for example, we see within the mythology of the Big Bang that this depicts the universe as essentially expanding from a singularity. And if we seriously contemplate this, it basically paints a picture of the forms of reality as essentially converging at a single point in time. And from this single point in time, everything evolves, everything expands and develops, and we see the diversity of forms. But the diversity of forms essentially sprouts from a singular seed, And then when you think about this, you realize that, I am one of the many forms that extends from this source, right? And therefore the ego is a minute expression of this greater reality, which I am continuous with. The ego, it's like a ship in a sea. It appears separate, but it's not isolated from the water that surrounds it. In fact, it depends fundamentally on the water for its existence. This separation, it is an illusion. Boundaries are permeable. They are constantly shifting, and reality, it flows like fractals with patterns revealing deeper forms within themselves. Boundaries which we perceive at one level will always dissolve when we zoom in and closely inspect into them. And, the ego, this voice that we experience within us, it is merely a pattern of reality that refers to itself. It's a kind of loop. It loops in on itself. And sometimes in this sort of looping, it can create the sense of, a sense of separation that, I am the voice that is referring to itself. But you have to think like, what is the voice referring to? Is that reality which it's referring to not also me? And I think the way we sort of can experience the illusory nature of the separation which some can interpret the ego to produce, we can pierce through this illusion by bringing our attention to it, essentially, by shifting our awareness. And you do this by observing the ego, observing the little monkey mind, the natterings, the voices within your head. You observe them, but you don't identify them with them. You simply watch and allow its processes to do what it does. And as you're doing this, you are essentially peeling back the layers of your perception. And as you peel back the layers of your perception, and particularly how you perceive the egoic voice within, or just the voice within, let's not even talk about ego and all that sort of stuff. As you sort of listen, you may encounter a kind of profound stillness and silence. The chattering of the ego may sort of relax to the silence, maybe an eerie silence, depends on your interpretation. But if you think about, you don't disappear in between thoughts, right? The chattering, the internal thoughts, processes, they always emerge from silence. And as you sort of do this sort of practice of tapping into the silence that precedes and lies prior to thought, you will find yourself essentially mindfully orienting from a place of being rather than wanting. It's our thoughts, you see, which take us into a state of wanting. And they take us into this sort of illusion of separation, this illusion of incompleteness, you know. And this is quite a profound thing to seriously think about, and it is the essence of enlightenment or awakening or seeing deeper into the nature of your reality and who you are, essentially. And I say that this sort of exercise of ego integration, it is an integration rather than a killing of the ego. The ego doesn't disappear upon enlightenment. Rather, I'd say it ceases to be the master of your affairs. It rather becomes a kind of a servant to this higher knowing of your true self. There's no need to kill the ego. It's essentially a survival program of your organism. Much the same way in which breathing or any kind of sensation is just an aspect of your organism, one of its processes. All these sensations, this diversity of sensations, they are just forms of perception that are interwoven with the fabric of reality. And I think that when we can recognize our true nature and transcend identification with the ego, I think this is a integral aspect of building more enlightened societies, systems which are not predicated upon separation, upon profit or power, but rather by collective awakening, by the ethics of peace and compassion. And this comes because we begin to start seeing others, animals, and nature not as separate to us, but as continuous essentially with us. And and through this insight, you recognize that inflicting harm onto another, or inflicting harm to something which you designate as not you, it becomes illusory because you recognize that you are hurting yourself in the activity of hurting others. And I think through this insight, through seeing through the veil of separation, we can end much needless suffering that we inflict. And I think in this time especially, we need to rediscover this core, this perennial and ancient insight into the nature of reality. But I'll leave that at that. Hope you've enjoyed. Adios. Like and subscribe, all that jazz. Bosh.